They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But at 73, I learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones slowly killing you from the inside out. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and I spent 47 years married to a man who convinced me I was lucky he stayed. For nearly 5 decades, I believed him. The morning, everything changed, started like any other. I was in the kitchen at 5:30, preparing Thomas's breakfast exactly the way he liked it. 2 eggs over easy, bacon crispy but not burnt, toast cut diagonally, coffee black and steaming. The routine had become as automatic as breathing, performed in the heavy silence that had settled over our house, like dust on forgotten furniture. Thomas emerged from his study where he'd been sleeping for the past 3 years, claiming my snoring kept him awake. He never said good morning anymore. Instead, he'd grunt his way to the table, scan his breakfast with the critical eye of a restaurant inspector, and find something wrong. "Your yolks are too runny again," he said without looking up. "I don't know why you can't get something so simple right after all these years." I apologized automatically, the words falling from my lips like a prayer I'd memorized long ago. "Just forget it. I'll eat it as is." Again. The word, again, hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. It contained within it every imperfect meal, every failed attempt at pleasing him, every moment I'd fallen short of his impossible standards. Later that morning, our daughter Caroline called. After exchanging pleasantries, she dropped the bomb I should have seen coming. "Mom, David and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you and Dad to consider some kind of assisted living situation. You're both getting older. And that house is so big." At 73, I still drove myself everywhere, maintained a garden, and volunteered at the library twice a week. But somewhere along the way, I'd become someone who needed to be managed rather than consulted. "We're managing fine, dear," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. "That's not what Dad says. He told David you've been forgetting things. Leaving the stove on. Misplacing important papers. He's worried about you." The betrayal cut deep. Thomas had been talking to our son-in-law about me behind my back, painting me as some doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with basic tasks. Thomas had emerged from the bathroom and was standing close enough to hear my conversation. "Caroline's right, you know. This house is getting to be too much for you. Maybe it's time to face reality." Reality. As if my entire existence had become some delusion I was clinging to out of stubborn pride. The next few days passed in a haze of forced normalcy. Thomas made phone calls to assisted living facilities while I pretended not to notice. He scheduled tours without consulting me, printed out brochures, and left them on the counter, like hints I was supposed to gratefully acknowledge. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early October. I'd returned from the library to find Thomas in his study with Caroline and David. They'd driven down unannounced, and were sitting around his desk like board members preparing to deliver a corporate decision. "Margaret, come in here," Thomas called. "We need to discuss something." I stood in the doorway, still holding my purse, and felt like a stranger in my own home. Caroline avoided my eyes while David shuffled papers uncomfortably. "We've found a lovely place in Riverside Gardens," Thomas began. "It's only 20 minutes from Caroline and David, so you'll be closer to the grandchildren. They have activities, meal service, housekeeping, everything taken care of." "I notice you said, 'you'll be closer,' not, 'we'll be closer,'" I said quietly. The silence was deafening. Caroline finally spoke up. "Mom, Dad explained that you two have different needs now. He's looking at a smaller apartment in town, something more suitable for a single person." Single person. After 47 years of marriage, I was being discarded like an old appliance that had outlived its usefulness. Thomas wasn't just moving me to assisted living. He was leaving me there. "I've already put down a deposit," Thomas said. "You can move in next month." "What if I don't want to go?" I asked. "Margaret, be reasonable. You can't stay here alone. You're not capable of managing a house this size anymore." That night, after Caroline and David had left and Thomas had retreated to his study, I sat alone in our bedroom and took inventory of my life. When had I become so willing to disappear? The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. It was Janet Morrison, my college roommate and maid of honor nearly 5 decades ago. "Maggie, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue, but I heard through the grapevine that you might be going through some changes. I wanted you to know that my guest house is sitting empty, and if you ever need a place to think things through, it's yours." Janet lived in Portland, Oregon, 3,000 miles from everything I'd ever known. "The offer stands, Maggie. No questions asked. No time limit. Just a chance to remember who you are without everyone else telling you who you should be." For the first time in longer than I could remember, I had options. Real options that didn't involve other people making decisions about my life. Later that day, while Thomas was at his weekly golf game, I went into his study and found the contract he'd signed with Riverside Gardens. My signature line was blank, waiting for me to make his decision official. This wasn't a discussion. It was a done deal that required only my compliance. The next few days passed in a strange haze of clarity. I continued my normal routine, but internally I was planning an escape that felt both terrifying and liberating. I researched flights to Portland and called Janet back to accept her offer. "You don't have to explain anything," she said. "Just come when you're ready." After 47 years of marriage, how do you choose which possessions define who you are? I settled on 2 suitcases of clothes, my mother's jewelry, a few photo albums, and watercolor paints I'd bought years ago but never had the courage to use. On the day of my departure, I left a note for Thomas on the kitchen counter. "I've gone to visit an old friend. I need some time to think about what I want for the rest of my life, rather than what others have decided I should want. I'll be in touch when I'm ready." The flight to Portland was my first time on an airplane in over a decade. As the plane lifted off, I watched my old life shrink away below me and felt excitement about the unknown. Janet met me at the airport with a hug that lasted longer than any embrace I'd received in recent memory. The drive took us through neighborhoods I'd never seen, past coffee shops with names I'd never heard. Everything was foreign and therefore full of possibility. Janet's guest house was a small cottage with a kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and living area that opened onto a private garden. It was the first space in decades that was entirely mine, answerable to no one's preferences but my own. That first night, I called Caroline to let her know where I was. The conversation was predictably difficult. "Mom, what are you doing? Dad is furious. You can't just run away from your problems." "I'm not running away. I'm taking time to think about what I actually want instead of just accepting what other people have decided is best for me." "You're being selfish, Mom. We're trying to help you, and you're making everything harder than it needs to be." Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe it's time I learned how. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own space for the first time in longer than I could remember. The freedom was so unfamiliar it almost felt like weightlessness. Janet had gone back to school after her husband died, earned a degree in art therapy, and now worked with trauma survivors. "I used to think retirement meant winding down," she said. "Now I think it means finally having the freedom to figure out who you really are when nobody else is defining you." The phone calls from home continued daily for the first week. Thomas's messages grew increasingly angry. Caroline alternated between guilt trips and logical arguments. Their collective pressure might have worked if I'd been sitting in my old kitchen. But from the safe distance of Janet's cottage, their arguments sounded thin and self-serving. Meanwhile, I was discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I enrolled in a watercolor class and found I had natural talent. I volunteered at a literacy program. I made friends based on shared interests rather than obligation. 3 weeks into my stay, I had a breakthrough conversation with Rosa, a 68-year-old woman in my art class who'd recently left her own difficult marriage. "The hardest part isn't leaving," she said. "It's believing you deserve better than what you've been accepting. We spend so many years being told we're asking for too much when we're really asking for the bare minimum of respect and consideration." That night, I called Thomas for the first time since leaving. "You're having some kind of breakdown, Margaret. This isn't like you." Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I've been trying so hard to be someone else's version of me that I forgot who I actually am. I'm not coming back to the life we had. If you want to work on building something different together, something based on mutual respect and consideration, we can talk about that. But I'm done being treated like hired help who should be grateful for room and board." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about his willingness to change. One morning, about a month into my stay, I woke up and realized I wasn't angry anymore. The rage had transformed into something calmer but more powerful. Clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept going forward. I called Caroline and had a different kind of conversation. "I love you, but I won't continue to have a relationship where I'm treated like a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected." Later that week, Janet helped me find a small apartment in her neighborhood. When I signed the lease using my maiden name for the first time in nearly 50 years, I felt like I was signing a declaration of independence. 3 months after arriving in Portland, I received divorce papers from Thomas. Instead of feeling threatened, I felt relieved. I hired my own lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who specialized in representing older women in divorce proceedings. The settlement I eventually received provided me with genuine financial independence for the first time in my life. Meanwhile, Caroline and I began rebuilding our relationship on more equal terms. She visited Portland, and we had conversations that went deeper than we'd managed in years. "I guess I thought that's how marriages worked after a certain point," she admitted. Dad taking charge of everything and you just going along with whatever he decided. That's how our marriage worked, I told her. But it doesn't have to be how marriages work in general. 6 months after leaving my old life, I was settled into a routine that felt authentically mine. My watercolor paintings had improved to the point where I was considering entering a local art show. My volunteer work had expanded into a part-time paid position. I'd made friends who knew me as Margaret Sullivan, not as Thomas's wife or Caroline's mother. The woman who looked back at me from the mirror each morning was recognizable but transformed. The defensive posture I'd carried for decades had been replaced by something straighter and more confident. Caroline brought the twins to visit for Christmas, and they were fascinated by my art supplies and the stories I told about my adventures in a new city. For the first time, I felt like a grandmother who had something interesting to offer beyond cookies and indulgence. One evening, as I sat in my apartment watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades I was learning to capture with my brushes, I realized I'd stopped thinking about my old life as something I'd lost, and started seeing it as something I'd outgrown. People often ask me if I'm lonely, living by myself for the first time in over 4 decades. The answer is clearly no. I'd been lonely for years, while surrounded by people who claimed to love me, but treated me as invisible. Now I'm alone by choice, surrounded by relationships I've chosen rather than inherited. The greatest gift of this late-life reinvention hasn't been the freedom or independence, though those are precious. It's been the discovery that it's never too late to remember who you are underneath all the roles and expectations others have layered on top of you. Last month, I had my first solo art show at a small gallery downtown. Thomas sent a congratulations card that was polite but distant. Caroline flew out for the opening and told everyone who would listen that her mother was an artist, speaking about me with pride and respect that had been absent from our relationship for too long. As I stood in that gallery, surrounded by friends I'd made and work I'd created, I thought about the woman who'd stood in that study 18 months ago, listening to her life being reorganized without her input. She couldn't have imagined that the scariest decision she'd ever made would turn out to be the one that saved her life. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but at 74, I'm learning new ones every day. The trick isn't really learning something new. It's remembering something you always knew but forgot you had permission to act on, that your life belongs to you, and it's never too late to start living it on your own terms.